Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today for our monthly webinar. My name is Karen Skiles, and I'll be your hostess for today's webinar. Today's presentation is titled, What is DevOps?, presented by our own Jane Grove, President of ITSM Academy. You can download the slides for today's presentation by clicking on the link in your webinar chat window. Some of you may have firewalls blocking you from accessing the Citrix webinar tool that we use. You can also download the slides directly from our website at www.itsmacademy.com/download.html. And that link is also in your chat window. Webinars are now mobile, and you can view them on smartphones and tablets, so just download the appropriate app for your device. We've been delivering our monthly web education to you since 2007, and we're really happy to see so many returning guests with us again today. At ITSM Academy, we believe that one of our important roles in the industry is to help organizations get buy-in for their IT service management programs. To assist you in your efforts, we offer this webinar and many of our previous webinars to your organization in a virtual environment at no charge for a group of 4 or more participants. There's no selling involved. It's just our way of reaching out to the community to help organizations with IT service management programs. So if you're interested in having us deliver this webinar for you and your group, please email us at info@itsmacademy.com. As I said, today we're pleased to have ITSM Academy's President, Jane Grove, with us, and Jane's presentation today is titled, What is DevOps? We'll be tweeting this during the presentation today. If you'd like to join in, please use hashtag #ITSM Academy and join us. We'd like to ask you a couple of polling questions to give Jane some information about our guests today. So here's our first polling question. How familiar are you with DevOps? Are you implementing a DevOps program? Are you considering a DevOps program? Have you heard about it, but you're not really quite sure what it is, never heard of it, or not applicable? Please make your selection. During the presentation, the information that Jane presents may raise some questions, or you may be looking for some additional clarification or information. We've scheduled Jane's time at the end of today's session to answer your questions. To submit questions, just use the chat window that appears on the GoToMeeting box, which is located in the upper right corner of your screen. Open your chat window by clicking on the plus sign next to the word chat. Just type your question in the chat log section and click the send button. Feel free to submit your questions at any time at all during the presentation. We have a large number of attendees for this session, and Jane has a lot to cover. We'll answer as many questions as possible today, and then we'll also compile a Q&A with all of the questions and the answers today, and we'll provide you an email with a link to download the report in just a few days. We have 80. Please make your final selection on the polling question. Okay, and let's see. Whoa, okay. 51%, Jane, have heard about it but not sure what DevOps is, followed by 21% considering the program. We've got 13% of our audience today implementing a DevOps program, as well as 13% who have never heard of it. Thank you. And our next polling question. Do your dev and ops teams work well together? Often with good workflow and communication, not always, but they're working on it. Sometimes, but without consistency, rarely, they don't engage each other enough or not applicable. Please make your selection. Last year we rolled out Game On, the in-class learning games for the classroom, and they've been really very well received by the learners. In addition to Jane's presentation today, we'll also be using this technology at the end of the webinar portion. We'll add the instructions for downloading the virtual keypad towards the end, and just a reminder that we can accept 50 people to play the game at that time, so get logged in to be one of the first 50 in there so that you can be included in that. And please make your final selection on the polling question. And let's see, Jane, we have, okay, 38% Sometimes, though, without consistency, the DevOps teams are working together. 26%, not always, but they are working on it, so that's encouraging. 21% not applicable, 9% rarely, they don't engage each other enough, and 7% often with good workflow and communication. So that's a low number there on that one. Thank you for sharing that information. And one last polling question. Have you read the book, The Phoenix Project? Yes, considering, no, or have never heard of it? Please make your selections. Okay. And for those of you that haven't read it, I'm halfway through it, and it's a great book. I just wanted to share that. Very interesting. Okay. We're going to close that poll. And we have 15% have read the book. I'm sorry, 21% have not read the book, 18% are considering reading the book, 15% have not read the book, and 47% have not heard of the book. Well, you're going to be in for a treat, I think. Well, thank you for sharing that information to give Jane a better sense of our audience today. Now, for those of you who are new to ITSM Academy, here is a quick overview. The Academy is a full-service provider of ITSM education. We've trained tens of thousands of students on-site across the Americas and in our public training centers in Fort Lauderdale, Dallas, Minneapolis, Phoenix, Reston, Salt Lake City, and Tampa, as well as in our virtual classrooms. Now let's introduce today's speaker, Jane Grohl. Jane is ITSM Academy's co-founder and president. She holds numerous certifications, including ITIL Expert and Service Manager, as well as ISO 20000 Consultant and Certified Scrum Master. Jane is active in the ITSM and DevOps communities and is a frequent webinar and conference presenter. Prior to co-founding ITSM Academy, Jane worked for more than 20 years as an IT practitioner and in IT senior management. Her experience spans a wide range of industries, which include legal, telecommunications, retail, nonprofit, insurance, and hospitality. Jane ensures that all ITSM Academy trainers bring similar practical experiences to each classroom and that all of our courseware and content incorporates the same depth of knowledge. Good morning, Jane.
Good morning or good afternoon to our attendees today. Thank you for spending some time with us and learning a little bit more about DevOps. I have to start by saying I'm particularly excited about being able to share this information with you. Since about spring of 2012, several of us at ITSM Academy started to get engaged in the DevOps community and have watched this very grassroots movement grow into some type of a cultural phenomenon. So for those of you who have heard of it and aren't too familiar with it, I hope to be able to just bring a little bit of light. For those of you who have never heard of it, my business partner likes to say, take out a pen, write down today's date, and write down my name, because you will be hearing about DevOps for the rest of your career, and of course I want some credit for that. So it's a great opportunity to share something that as a practitioner, I also had an opportunity to experience kind of that chasm between Dev and Ops, and we can talk a lot about why this has certainly come to the forefront. So let's get started, and you know, we have to start the story with the business perspective. So if we look at, you know, how IT and the business interact, we often see, and I apologize, there's a little bit of background noise. We often see that there's, you know, good intentions together, but certainly there's some disconnect, and we like to call that our cadence is off. So historically, the business has always wanted to go very fast, particularly with the introduction of technology and the recognition that technology is an enabler of business innovation that maybe they weren't able to do before. Dev historically has moved a little bit slower, so translating those requirements into some type of an application or service and being able to bring that into production and let the business see value has, you know, required scope requirements and other pieces that the development process, particularly using waterfall, where they would get down to the testing stage of it and then figure out they had issues and had to go all the way back up the waterfall in order to be able to move forward. And then poor Grumpy Cat Ops has always said, not that we don't want to deploy it, but we also have requirements. And I come from the operational side of the house. So we also have requirements, and our requirements are such that we can't allow you to enter into our nice, stable production environment until those requirements are met. So the businesses wanted to go very fast, and Dev and Ops separately and together has sort of been a bottleneck or a constraint that the business has felt. And it's part of the reason I think that sometimes the business's perception of IT is not as good as it should be. So the development teams took some steps to make things better, and they started to adopt some agile practices and looked at waste by introducing some lean concepts as well. And so they sort of broke their development into kind of two categories, where the business wanted to go very fast. The developers started to move more into a continuous delivery model for those small little code drops that they do on a very frequent basis. And then again, move slowly where it's necessary to move slowly on the more complex projects. But operations still had its rigor. And again, for most of you in the service management space, you've probably seen processes like change management that have good intention but are often built in a very bureaucratic way, so that everyone's moving fast but moving into that rigor wall of either change management or release management or other operational requirements. So development did a very good job of trying to develop in smaller increments, to be able to deploy in smaller increments by adopting some agile and lean approaches, but service management still wasn't on board in terms of being part of that workflow. Sorry, I don't know what is going on here, but we're getting there where we need to be. Okay. So if we look at the introduction of DevOps, if we start to marry agile development and agile and lean service management processes where we're sharing a lot of the practices and we're improving the workflow, then we're also improving the cadence. And so what's ultimately happening is the business wants to go faster. Continuous delivery is a great workflow flowing from development into operations, into production. There's a commonality between Dev and Ops in terms of shared tools, in terms of shared practices, in terms of shared knowledge, and the business is getting finally what it needs to go forward. Now, that's the business's perspective, right? The business is getting what it needs. Time to value is improving in organizations that are starting to adopt DevOps practices. But we now have to kind of go behind the curtain and look at the IT perspective. So part of our wall of confusion, and a lot of this comes from ITIL, is we have development teams that very much not only want change, they're chartered to make changes, and they're chartered to make those very quickly. And then we have operational teams that want stability, right? We've worked really hard to get stable environments, and we're a little risk adverse. And so that wall of confusion is, what do we do here? We have to be flexible enough or agile enough in order to be able to move forward, but we also have to retain stability because the tolerance for unavailability is pretty low. So how do we find that balance? And the question then becomes, what does the business want? And so if we focus too much or shift that scale too much in one direction or the other, we run risk. Right? If we focus so much on change that we risk our stability, well, that's not good. We can't have unavailable services. But if we focus so much on stability, we're not offering the business the innovation that it wants. And the business wants both, right? I mean, there is no compromise here. The business wants both. It wants change and it wants stability, and it wants Dev and Ops to clean up their own house and make that happen. And that's where Dev and Ops' first goal or first focus has to be together. We both want the business to win. And until we get to that point, and it's not that anybody doesn't want the business to win, that's really not part of the culture. It's just that we're so siloed that when we're done with our part, we either throw it over the fence to operations, or operations puts up a wall and says, well, now we've been studying process, and our process says you cannot go into production unless you've met criteria A, B, C, and D, and unless we've done, the right rigor of testing and whatever. But the first goal of DevOps is to make the business win. And in today's environment, with how quickly Dev is evolving, We absolutely need to make sure that we are all focused on making the business win. And you see organizations that have started to adopt DevOps, and how they've done this is they've really integrated the teams, the culture, the approaches that Dev and Ops are taking together, so that they're both seeing and working together, sort of holding hands a little bit, maybe singing a little kumbaya as they're trying to get business over that finish line. And again, as you all know, innovation, technical innovation is moving so rapidly that for those of us in IT, it's sometimes hard for us to keep up. You know, BYOD, we weren't talking about BYOD 5 years ago, and certainly we are now. How are we going to handle that? You know, the new innovations, the new applications, the new services that are available are just tremendous. So that leads us to a discussion of what is DevOps. And I'm sure for those of you who answered the poll and say you've heard about it, you know, the ITSM community is talking a lot about DevOps. I participated yesterday in a panel through Bright Talk from ITSM, excuse me, and we were talking about DevOps and other trends for 2014, and there were 4 of us on the panel, and we independently made our predictions. So we were asked to produce slides that just gave forth our predictions for 2014, and every one of us independently put DevOps on that list. So the question becomes why? Unlike ITIL, unlike other practices like COVID, there is no publications that are associated with it. There is no, the best practices are just starting to emerge. But there is a lot of interest in DevOps, and it really comes down to this definition. It is first and foremost a cultural and professional movement. It's very grassroots, but it stresses sort of the organizational change aspects of managing services. And while we don't necessarily call it, you know, completely ITIL or ITSM, it's really looking at some of the gaps that we've seen on the development side and on the service management side that are really organizational or human aspects of working together. Communication, collaboration, integration, right? So as opposed to, and again, let's think about today's IT environment. The days where we had 25 people all working in the same building, kind of cubicle to cubicle, is in some cases still a reality. In most cases, it's not. So the ability to stress the communication between very large, very dispersed IT organization to really encourage that collaboration, to encourage the integration of the practices is something that is perhaps unspoken but necessary. And so DevOps is bringing that to the surface. It acknowledges that there is this interdependency between operations and development. And while we've always known it's there, it's actually, again, bringing this to the forefront that we can't operate together if we don't work together, right? If we don't look at our flows together. It really helps, and again, at the end of the day, we need to be able to produce quality software faster, right? The days of being able to, you know, take our time, particularly on these smaller increments of development, and that's what's happening. I mean, that's a very big shift in the way we do things. The big complex projects will always be the big complex projects. But what DevOps is encouraging, kind of marrying against what Agile has introduced, are small teams, small deployments, small developments, and rapid, frequent developments as opposed to, you know, the once-a-week change management process, or, you know, how we traditionally do release management, again, on these smaller kind of increments. Kind of goes back to looking at some of the models that are suggested in ITIL. Big part of DevOps is allowing Dev and Ops together to respond to the needs of stakeholders faster, right? So we need to be able to improve what we call our velocity. Velocity is the ability of an individual or a team to absorb work. So we can increase the rate of our production or the rate of our time to value if we can increase our personal and our team velocity, our ability to absorb work and to make sure that work is done. And it does support the use of Agile development processes. And one of the key concepts of Agile development processes, again, we do small increments of work, but each increment is done. And part of that definition is you define what done is. Done moves from development to ops. And maybe it's not ready for deployment, but we avoid a lot of what we call work in progress. Work in progress is bad, right? Work in progress really allows an organization to have their hands in a lot of things but not really get anything done. So DevOps is encouraging getting things done, right? Donna Knapp from our organization calls it get her done with quality. It's partially recognizing that our traditional approaches to application development, such as waterfall, and our traditional approaches to IT operations, which is kind of pure idle, are not necessarily meeting the accelerated demands for IT services. Now, let me caveat that. The idle service lifecycle very much supports DevOps. In fact, I like to think of DevOps as kind of the cog that's driving that lifecycle, because there is a perception, whether it's real or perceived, that dev is not part of that service lifecycle. So DevOps sits in the middle of it, but it also means that we have to adapt our service management practices and our development practices so that we have some commonalities there. So just a little history of DevOps. It's kind of interesting. DevOps actually grew. It's a very, very grassroots movement. On the development and on the technical operations side, when you look at who's involved in it, it's a lot of very fast, very web-based companies, but it basically grew out of a Twitter hashtag. So at the Velocity conference, John Allspar, who is a key member of the DevOps community, really did a 10 plus deploys per day and demonstrated that you could do that many deployments if dev and operations work together, right? So if you had that cooperation between the teams. Patrick Dubois, who is known as the godfather of DevOps, created the first DevOps Days, and several of us at ITSM Academy have had the pleasure of going to some of these DevOps Days events, which are now cropping up all over the world, and they were really just a couple of days talking about how can dev and ops work together. John Jenkins of Amazon in 2011 at the Velocity conference did a presentation called the Velocity Culture, right, the ability to absorb more work. And Gene Kim in 2013, and some of you may know Gene from the VisOps days. Gene is a very frequent presenter. He and some colleagues published a business novel called The Phoenix Project, and I know many of you have never heard of it from the poll. If you have not heard of it or you have not read it, absolutely encourage you to do it. We're going to talk a little bit in a minute about some of the concepts, but it is a business novel, and it is built from the book The Goal. So if you've ever read the book The Goal, but the Phoenix Project was the first time that we didn't get a lot of practice out of it. There's enough in there, but it also illustrated the where we are in many of our cases today and where we could be if we applied some very, very simple approaches. So the Phoenix Project is sort of the first DevOps book that's emerged to be sort of a cult classic. If you're really interested in and it's a great video, if you're really interested in the history of DevOps, I do encourage you to go to this YouTube link. It's a very cute video, and it really does bring it to light in a big way. So as I said before, we've seen a lot of this renewed interest or new interest in DevOps, and if you start to look at some of the organizations that are adopting a DevOps culture, it's kind of interesting because it reminds me of the early days of ITIL. When we saw the early days of ITIL, you know, we of course had the Procter & Gamble's that were one of the first adopters, and you know, the famous article that said we saved a lot of money in IT costs. Well, in DevOps, you sort of see the same thing, although the web pioneers were really the first ones. They deploy so much, so frequently, that when you start to look at the organizations that have such a technical presence, like Amazon. I mean, Amazon lives and breathes by its technology. You look at Netflix, another organization that really lives and breathes by its technology. These were really the early pioneers, the ones that were participating in the Twitter discussions on DevOps. They are frequent speakers at Velocity conferences. They are all frequent attendees and speakers at the DevOps days. And then we have some academia. So we've seen some of the universities really start to take hold of this concept of DevOps and start to apply it to their IT departments, but also start to do you know, a little bit of academic research about it. Like ITSM, first adopters almost always financial institutions. We saw that when ITSM started to really come into its being. We saw a very big movement into highly regulated environments like financial institutions. And I find this kind of interesting that we're seeing retailers really start to get engaged in the DevOps movements, and that's likely because of e-commerce. My guess is because they also have a very strong web presence, and the requirement that retailers have a good e-commerce solution so that I can go to a store, I could order online, is absolutely there. So we're definitely starting to see some of that emerge in the retail space. But as far as interest goes, I mean, it's been showing up everywhere. Now, here's some interesting statistics. And every year, a tool provider called Puppet works with Gene Kim's IT Revolution Press, and they do surveys on what's happening in the DevOps world. And actually, they're working on one right now, and they've published that this year's survey is going to look not at what's been seen so far, but what best practices are emerging. So we're very excited about the fact that we're going to actually start to capture some of those best practices. But the results that have been seen so far by organizations that have published or announced that they are introducing a DevOps culture to their environment is they've absolutely, 63% say they've improved the quality of their software, and they're able to deploy software much more frequently, and there is improved visibility into process and requirements. And those three alone, I think, are huge. The next one, though, really lies at the heart of DevOps. They've noticed a very big culture change. And until you can change the way people think, the way they behave, achieving the top three will be much more difficult. So they've definitely seen this spirit of cooperation. They've definitely seen more collaboration. Some organizations at DevOps Days talked about creating single teams under single management, where Dev and Ops would roll up to the same senior management. More responsiveness to business needs, 55% said. That's huge. We've been talking about that in the service management space for a long time. And then the bottom three are really looking at some of the more technical aspects, that agile development is going much more smoothly and much more quickly. Change management, agile change management, I love that. The ability to look at change models so that the very complex projects would have a model that says here are the steps that you need to do. But the small, frequent deployments would also have a model that says, okay, we're going to do automated testing. And the amount of rigor and our ability to monitor immediately after production will be increased so that risk is managed, but we can push those deployments through much more quickly. And then I thought the last one was pretty interesting, and that's the quality of code is improving. So even though we're moving faster, we're not sacrificing quality. So if you're interested in getting a copy of this 2013 report, we're going to make it available on our My ITSM Academy resource page, so you'll certainly be able to have that opportunity. And when the next one comes out, we'll certainly publish that as well. Same thing, in that survey of practice, something really interesting emerged of organizations that were implementing DevOps maturity. Now remember, this is cultural as much as it is using tools and process, but those that implemented it were 5 times more likely to be high performing than organizations that weren't. And anyone that's familiar with Gene Kim knows that he also is a participant in the IT Process Institute, and they've been doing a lot of research on high-performing organizations for a very, very long time. So this was kind of an impressive, and this actually does come from Gene, kind of an impressive approach that they were 5 times more likely to be high-performing. What does that mean? It means they were much more efficient, they were much more effective, and the quality of the deployments, the quality of the services that the business was using, the value the business was getting out of those services, whether small deployments or big deployments, was much greater. It's kind of an impressive statistic. So ultimately, what does DevOps give you? DevOps provides companies competitive advantage because they are able to deliver better software faster. And this is not just for IT shops. Every organization, regardless of whatever business you're in today, has a very, very strong technical element. Right? We all use IT services in one way or another. So your competitive advantage, whether you're a government agency, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're a for-profit or a publicly traded organization, you have competitive advantage because you're able to introduce more capabilities to your customers, whoever they are, much more quickly with a high level of quality. I mean, think about Amazon.com as a perfectly good example of that. I go to Amazon and I place an order. It's very easy. The website's always up. That's great. But it starts to make me suggestions. It says things like, well, people that looked at what you're looking at, 52% bought it, and another 40% bought something else. I mean, there's so much interaction with the technology today that it's important. So I really do want to emphasize the cultural aspects of DevOps, because I know that everybody's trying to put their arms around what is DevOps, and it is more than just organizational change, but organizational change is a very, very key aspect of it. And if you look at this quote from Peter Drucker, it's a very, very famous quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So if you don't have a culture that encourages the realization of your strategy, then your strategy is going to be much weaker. So a big part of DevOps is not only encouraging that culture, it's instilling that culture. So what has come out of DevOps is this acronym CAMS, and it's really looking at the elements of a good culture, right, a good IT culture. Well, first of all, we need to make sure that human interaction is there, that there's the human aspect of it, the collaboration, the communication that we as human beings need is absolutely there. But we can't underestimate the value of automation. Automation helps us go faster, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. We have to be able to leverage our automated capabilities. Some of those automations may include deployment tools, they may include configuration tools. Certainly the ITSM tools are a part of automation, but if you read any article about DevOps, whether it's from Forrester or Gartner or any of the DevOps folks, automation is a piece of this, and the tools that are getting very involved in DevOps are kind of interesting tools. You can't have automation if you're not willing to measure. So being able to monitor and measure your services, your deployments, your releases is critical. And one of the things that's emerging there is the ability to measure, but Dev and Ops being able to share those measurements almost simultaneously and almost instantaneously. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then a big part of the culture is sharing, right? We have to be willing to share our knowledge. We have to have mutual respect. We have to respect core competencies, and we have to be able to share a big piece of how we're going to develop and deploy and operate software in order for us to be able to continue forward. So CAMS is another concept that's kind of emerging as a big piece of DevOps. And when you go to the DevOps days, a lot of the presentations will focus on CAMS. It's all about the people, right? It's all about the way they think, the way they interact, they behave, they work, they perceive themselves and their colleagues. It's about organizational change, but organizational change sometimes has a little bit of a negative connotation. It's got this connotation of brainwashing. We're certainly not looking to do that, but it is transitioning the way that people think, right? So really breaking down those silos, really building those communities of collaboration, really forcing in some ways that mutual respect, because there is some perception and reality that are incorrect, right? We perceive that the dev has no hold on reality, and they believe that ops isn't as technical as they are. So really looking at how people work is a big piece of DevOps. And as I've said a couple of times, a lot of it's about small teams, right? In Scrum, if anyone's familiar with Scrum, Scrum says that a Scrum team shouldn't be more than 9 people. Right? So that's a manageable number. So as you do your development and deployment, can you keep those development and deployment teams to 9 people? And can you integrate your ops folks into your Scrum teams? Hopefully you can, right? Hopefully you can. People will adapt to the culture of your organization. And culture comes from the bottom up, and we've seen that with DevOps and grassroots. It also has to come from the top down, right? But it can happen anywhere in between the bottom and the top, right? Because this is about people. And if you've worked in an organization that had an awesome culture, you know what I mean, right? You work hard, there's a mutual loyalty, people are cooperative, there's no prima donnas. Some of the organizations have a no, and I can't say the word, but they really have policies that say if you're a jerk, you're not allowed to work here. Right? So they've really kind of, built their cultures so that we're all going to work hard, we're going to play hard, we're going to respect each other, and we're going to have that kind of cultural revolution of sorts. So I mentioned the Phoenix Project. There's lots of practices that are emerging in DevOps. Agile, if you're not familiar with Scrum, next month we're actually going to do a Scrum panel. So we'll do the Scrum in 5 minutes introduction. So we can give you sort of a high-level overview of Scrum, but Scrum practices where it's very team-based, where the flow of work is absolutely considered. There's things called Kanban boards, which is an opportunity to manage workflow as well. But all of that sort of wrapped up into this business novel. And as I said before, the Phoenix Project is just a great read. If you're an IT person, you read this book, you'll find yourself in there and you'll find all your colleagues in there. It is based on a book by Eliyahu Goldratt called The Goal. So The Goal is a book about process. It's also a business novel. But The Goal really looked at something called the theory of constraints. And this very much applies to service management, right? Very much applies to how we manage process. Every process will have at least one constraint or bottleneck. And if you improve the constraint or the bottleneck, you improve the entire process. So part of the theory of constraints says, okay, we need to look at our flow of work, and we need to be able to identify where there are constraints, right? Where the process is being squeezed into a bottleneck, and how do we improve that so that either the bottleneck gets wider or it goes away. And until we can recognize where our constraints are, then we will have a difficult time being able to understand the flow of work. So what Gene and his colleagues did in the Phoenix Project is they broke it down into 3 ways. And Gene will tell you he shamelessly borrowed this from The Goal because it was such an impactful book for him. So the first way says, okay, we need to understand and increase the flow of work. And until we understand how work flows and where those constraints lie, and sometimes those constraints lie in places that you're not completely familiar with, right? You're not expecting that the constraint is actually where it is. And if you look at DevOps as a perfect example, Dev does its thing, Ops does its thing, and I would bet that most of you who responded in terms of the relationship between your Dev and Ops, the constraint probably lies somewhere in that transition, right? Ops probably either says, I'm sorry, I can't deploy that right now because I don't have the right documentation and I don't have, the right installation instructions and we haven't tested it enough or, whatever. So that's probably a constraint there. Ops probably feels the constraint because Dev probably says, well, the heck with that. We're just going to deploy it anyhow and throw it over the fence. And now Ops, you have to live with it. And by the way, Ops has to live with it for a long time. So the first step in really looking at DevOps is really analyzing the flow of work, looking from concept to production and beyond. How does your work flow, and where are there, not even obstacles, where are there bottlenecks? Because work will flow through a bottleneck, right? You can pour water into a bottleneck. Work will continue to flow, but it will flow slowly. So it doesn't stop it, right? It's not an obstacle. It doesn't stop it, but it slows it down. And a big part of DevOps is being able to increase your velocity. So we need to make sure that the bottleneck widens first and hopefully goes away, right? The bottleneck becomes a tunnel, and then we can go through there as well. So that's the very first thing you need to do is just analyze. Where are we today in terms of how we're doing that? The second way is really to understand the needs of your customers. And customers are internal and external. So it's really kind of stepping outside yourself and saying, okay, excuse me, what do our customers really want? And how together can we make this happen, right? How can we respond to the needs of all of our customers so that we're not so embedded in the technology being our customer, we're embedded in the value that we're going to deliver to our customer. And the third way is a little scary to some of us in operations, but it's something that we need to overcome, and it's something that we need to embrace, and that's that the culture has to reward experimentation. Right? We don't want to be to welcome risk. Of course, we have to manage risk, but we also don't want to be so risk adverse that we're so afraid to experiment that we actually are stopping the business from being able to move as quickly and as innovatively as they would like. We have to be comfortable learning from failure. Now, as I said before, that's a little bit of an interesting paradigm shift because the business doesn't have a whole lot of tolerance for failure. And so part of it is building redundancies. Part of it is really being able to understand what risks we're willing to take and what risks we're really not willing to take, or from a regulatory compliance perspective, we're not allowed to take. So, but it is creating this culture of innovation, right? It's smart innovation. It's innovation that encourages you to think, to to experiment, to bring new thoughts, to be creative, but also being smart about the fact that we want to do it, but we want to do it in a way that the risk is minimized and that any failures can be addressed right away. And that's where a big part of the collaborative relationship, and tools certainly play a piece of it. So again, big key here, theory of constraints. Look it up on the internet. It's kind of interesting. Read the goal. And if you haven't read the Phoenix Project, I can't say it enough. It really is a great read. So I just want to kind of build on what DevOps is and what it isn't. First of all, it's not a framework, right? Today, in its current iteration, it is not a framework. It's not a method. It's not a standard. As I said before, we're seeing best practices starting to emerge. We're able to deliver against those best practices, and like in the early days of ITIL, remember ITIL's original project was to study best practices in a high-performing organization. But DevOps is not a framework, a standard, or a method. It's not a prescribed set of best practices, so it's not like COVID or ITIL or Scrum, which has a lot of standard practice around it. It's not a set of publications. Right now, the Phoenix Project is emerged. There's a lot of white papers. The Puppet Labs report is great. Gene and his colleagues are now working on a book called the DevOps Cookbook. And hopefully that will bring a little bit more of it together. And it's definitely not a tool. Although tools play an important role, DevOps is not a tool. So if you start to see that, again, let's go back to the ITSM history. The Academy just celebrated 10 years. We've seen a lot of this where, ITSM at some point was perceived to be a tool, or that you got it by buying a tool. You don't get ITSM by buying a tool, and you really don't get DevOps by buying a tool. It helps, but you don't get it. You don't get to write a PO to get DevOps. It really does depend on the integration of multiple frameworks, right? Agile, Lean, ITIL, COVID, common sense, right? Culture, organizational change. It is first and foremost a cultural movement, and there are good practices in being able to bring that culture together, like we just talked about with the theory of constraints. There's good practices there, but it needs to be a set of integrated practices. It isn't throwing out, the baby with the bathwater and saying, okay, everything we've done up until now isn't important because now we're going to do DevOps. It really is an evolution. It's an evolution of service management. It's an evolution of Agile. It is the marriage of Agile development and Agile service management. And when you put those two together, that's really where you get DevOps. It is an open commitment on everybody's part, not just on senior management's part, is an open commitment by everyone in your IT organization that we're going to collaborate, cooperate, and communicate better. And as I said, it is ultimately an integration. I like to think of it as an evolution, right? It's the next stage in IT's evolution, and it's a natural progression, right? It's grown organically. We're a very young industry, and this, we kind of lean one side to the other, and this is where we need to be to take us into the future. Now, as far as the role between ITSM and DevOps, I like to say that DevOps is ITSM's Playmaker. So if you know anything about sports, every team has a Playmaker, and again, I know basketball. I don't know a whole lot about football, but a little bit. And your Playmaker is the one that's going to control flow, right? It's going to control how the team's going to manage its offense. And again, think of development as offense. We want to proactively get ourselves into an innovative and time to value environment. So we look at DevOps, because there is that tight relationship, as being able to control flow. Looking at the constraints, opening up those bottlenecks, working together, improving communication and knowledge sharing, and passing those moves from development to operations and beyond, which ultimately will lead to the realization of goals. So I think the definition of a Playmaker is a good one here, because if you look at that definition from Wikipedia, it really does kind of sum up how DevOps is going to control flow and help the organization meet its goals well. But ITSM is what I like to call DevOps ever after, right? Services don't stop at the production, right? So once they go into production, it's not like we wipe our hands of it and move on to something else. There are some believe that that's what Dev does, and in some cases that's partially true. But ITSM, all of those processes, incident, problem, capacity, availability, demand management, security, all of those processes are what's going to take this software, service, application, deployment into the future. And it's going to live in the future for a long time, because why would we do it if it didn't, right? So for however long its life is in production, we need good service management processes to manage those. We manage services before production, but a good part of what happens in service management happens after transition, because the service lives there for a very long time. So we need a happily ever after. And I think ITSM and ITIL are the happily ever after, right? If we've done a good job in the development, we've done a good job of the workflows, we've done a good job of being able to remove those constraints, to move faster, to improve our velocity, to have the business do what, to be able to fulfill the business needs, then hopefully there will be a happily ever after. And ITSM is going to make that happily ever after happen. It's kind of like what happened after they went into the castle, right? They lived happily ever after. So I like to think that the relationship between DevOps and ITSM is really DevOps going to control flow or help to make sure that it's being passed along well so that we can meet our goals, and ITSM is going to be the happily ever after. Now, I mentioned something about tools before, and if you read a lot of articles about DevOps, and again, depending on which side of the Dev or the Ops that you're reading the articles about, every one of them will talk about automation, right? So again, if we look at the pendulum swinging in the ITSM world, first we're going to buy ITIL, so therefore we're going to get a tool, and then we were like, oh no, tools are, we don't need tools, don't think about tools, do your processes, and now we're swinging back to automation. You cannot do DevOps without automation. I mean, there's the reality. You can't go faster unless you've made automation a member of your team. And it's an important member of your team because it's going to improve flow. So automated testing, being able to do instantaneous monitoring, what I call social metrics, where from a monitoring or a dashboard perspective, Dev and Ops personnel can look at the same dashboard and socially comment. There's a little social media piece of it in terms of what they're seeing. So if there's something that's irregular, they can both see it immediately and collaboratively decide what to do about it. And if everything goes smoothly, everybody kind of shakes hands and moves on. So being able to use some of these tools, and some of these tools from the service management space you may not be familiar with. On the dev side, you probably are. Datadog, Puppet Labs, Sumo Logic, Opscode. These are very, very big players in the DevOps space. But we also need our ITSM tools, and we need to be able to make sure that our dev folks are comfortable with our change management tools and our release management tools, and being able to look at an incident problem or change database. Looking at our configuration management system, really being able to look at our service knowledge management system and contributing to it. So there are many, many more tools than what I've shown you on the screen, but it is a big piece of it. The bottom line, we really can deliver more business value by breaking down those silos. And it's more than just saying we're going to break down the silos. It's really looking at, okay, how do we work together better? What are the practices that are helping us? How do we reduce waste? How do we improve flow? And if you picked up any theme at all today, it's the improvement of flow that really is at the heart of DevOps. It's really looking at that term velocity, right? The ability to absorb work. And how do we improve that flow? And it's not just let's make change management less bureaucratic. It's really looking at the dynamics, human and technical dynamics of the flow from concept to production and happily ever after. That's going to be important. And then, that last bullet is pretty critical. How do we shorten the feedback loops, right? How do we create that collaborative environment by being able to allow us to feed back to each other and to be able to continually improve? If you look at the quote from Forrester, and there's a really good white paper that if you have a Forrester account, I would absolutely encourage you to get, and it's the 7 Habits of DevOps. But this is a great quote. DevOps is not only possible, it's necessary in the new world of business technology. We no longer can have that bottleneck or constraint between Dev and Ops, because that's often what's stopping us from being able to allow the business to go faster. So if you want to learn more, I'm very, very proud and pleased to tell you that ITSM Academy is going to be introducing some training. So over the next couple of months, we're going to be, and actually I think February is our first DevOps overview, take some of the things we talked about today and like an idle overview, gives you enough knowledge so that you understand more detail about the concepts. You can speak to it. You can certainly start to create that common vocabulary within your organization and that common knowledge within your organization. We're also introducing a 2-day DevOps fundamentals class, and that's going to really start to look at how do I build a DevOps culture, what practices can we start to introduce, what best practices are really emerging, and how are organizations starting to leverage those best practices and really truly build a DevOps environment. You know, you talk about implementing ITIL or implementing DevOps, but this is really more of an application. How do we apply the DevOps approach, the practices to our environment? If you don't already know about Scrum, I would highly encourage you to attend Certified Scrum Master. We're partnering with Winnow Management to deliver Certified Scrum Master. 4 of us at the Academy are Certified Scrum Masters. It is not just focused on software development. The approach, the concepts, the methods very much apply to any type of complex project, and we practice Scrum at the Academy, so we've really found that it has helped us to improve our velocity. And it is a first step to understanding Agile. And if you're going to do DevOps, as I said, Agile development is important. Agile service management is the other side of the equation, and we really need to have both. And then along those lines, we're introducing a 4-hour practical workshop called Agile Service Management, Applying Scrum to Process Design. And that's essentially taking Scrum, whether you're a certified Scrum Master or you've gone through a certified process design engineer, or you've kind of learned Scrum on your own. But we have some interesting insights into how you can improve your process design by applying a lot of the Scrum concepts, and to make your service management programs more successful, but also more incremental, so that you can get your success sort of a step at a time. And organizations that are doing it are really starting to see some results. So, as always, this is our ITSM Academy service catalog. I'll bring it back when we're doing some questions, but we've definitely started to embrace, and even more than embrace, DevOps is critical, and we are introducing it to our portfolio. Agile is critical, and we're introducing that to our service management portfolio as well, because we really do think it's the next generation of service management. So what I want to do next is let's play a game. So for any of you who have taken the ITSM Academy courses in the last year or so, we've started to introduce games in our classroom, and they are interactive. So the first 50 that can get onto the ping tool, you can actually answer the questions to the game via your computer or your iPhone or your tablet. So I'll give you a minute to go to www.c3ping.com, whether it's /mobile for your mobile device, or you're going to download the keypad on your computer. And our ping ID is 5381. So when you get there, it's going to ask you for an ID. Karen, I believe that you put that information up in the chat window.
I am doing that right now, Jane.
Okay, so I'm going to give them a minute, and then I'll launch the game. Because, it wouldn't be a good day if we weren't playing a game at work.
That's true.
Absolutely. Gamification. So in order for me to look, I'm sorry, Karen?
The information's in the chat for them, Jane.
Okay, so I'm going to actually close my screen for a minute so I can launch the game, and if you're looking for the ping instructions, again, they're in the chat window.
And while Jane's setting that up, just to let you know also, after we finish the game, we're going to be doing our Q&A with Jane. So if you have any questions you'd like her to answer for you, please submit them in your chat. Thank you.
Okay, so the ping information is up on the screen. Hopefully you can all see it. And hopefully 50 of you have made it in, so let's play. Okay, it looks like 12 brave souls. Oh, nope, here we go. A little bit more. It doesn't mean the rest of you can't play. You just can't play with your tools. I'll give you another couple of seconds. And let's go. First question. What does the business want? Okay, it looks like all our pingers chimed in, and I'm sure you all know they want all of the above. Which of the following is true about DevOps? Okay, and I'm sure you all remember it's not a best practice framework. It's going to evolve, and the best practices are coming forth, and I'm really proud that we've been capturing a lot of that. But there is an evolution that's occurring, and it's more about culture and automation and interaction. It's not based on the Phoenix Project, although the Phoenix Project, I think, has certainly brought a lot of the DevOps practices to light and put them in context within the storyline of an actual IT organization that's got some challenges. It's not a tool-based framework, but having said that, it's very, very important for me to reiterate, tools are a very big piece of this. And everything you'll read and you'll learn about DevOps is very much, has some type of an automation element. Now, can you do DevOps if you don't have tools? Absolutely. But my guess is most organizations have some type of tools in place to be able to leverage it, and then they can also identify it. It is first and foremost a culture. Think of grassroots. All right, last question. What does CAMS stand for? Okay, and the correct answer is D. Culture, automation, measurement, sharing. Up, Brad, you're a champion. Okay, so Karen, on that note, I'm going to bring up the deck, and hopefully you're going to have some good questions for me.
I have a couple of very good questions for you, Jane. But first of all, let me say thank you. I mean, certainly a lot of, comments on great information, great presentation, lots of food for thought here with DevOps and DevOps. So thank you for that. And just before we start the Q&A session, for those of you that need to drop off, I'd just like to remind you that our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, February 27th, and everyone is talking about Agile and Scrum. But how does Agile apply to service management and DevOps? Spend some time with two of our ITSM Academy certified Scrum Masters, Donna Knapp and Jane Grohl, as they share their insights and advice on how Agile can improve IT's velocity and time to value. So we hope you join us for that next month. All right, Jane, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, I have a question for you from Stephanie. And Stephanie is asking, for those organizations who have successfully introduced DevOps, what was their level of IT service management maturity?
Well, now that's a great question, right? That's a great question. If you talk to anybody in the DevOps environment, most of the organizations that have introduced DevOps have at least the critical processes in place. And when I say the critical processes, and by the way, there are organizations that do say incident or change really well, but you know, nobody's at, you know, level 5 on you know, the CMMI schedules. But there are organizations that needed to have operationally good monitoring, so good event management, certainly good change management, but also agile change management. I think you saw that in the slide. There are organizations that you know, had a collaborative problem management process. Now, again, when I say collaborative, it doesn't mean they had a beautiful end-to-end flow chart. Some of them likely did, but they had it in such a way that there was a commitment that when we found a problem, instead of lobbing back and forth, it's your fault, that there would be a collaborative root cause analysis. You know, looking at things like demand management. And I'll give you an example. Etsy, I don't know if anybody knows who Etsy is, but Etsy is a frequent presenter at the DevOps Days. And, you know, Etsy says they take 250,000 metrics a day. Now, luckily, you know, there's not one poor guy sitting in the data center looking at all of that. But in order for them to do that, you know, they first have to have good automation, but they also have to have good event management. They have to have good incident management. They have to have good, you know, problem management. Certainly they have to have good release management. So those processes have to be embedded enough in order for the organization. Now, could you grow them organically together? Absolutely. So is it a requirement that you have fully mature service management in order to, you know, bring a DevOps culture to your environment? No, not necessarily. You can really, and in some ways, I think that's a great way to do it, is you kind of grow it together, because the culture of DevOps becomes a part of service management, meaning everyone, development and operations, understands that service management is not just about production. Made you quiet, Karen, huh?
Yeah, I was muted. I have a question for you from Ron. And, oh, Stephanie said thank you for that answer, with a big exclamation point. Thank you, Stephanie.
You're welcome, Stephanie.
And Ron is asking, related to tools and applications to manage DevOps, are they the same as IT service management, or are the tools different?
The tools are different. Well, let me back up from that. They're the same and different, meaning tools that the development folks in your organization are probably using already are a big part of DevOps. Certainly there are tools that are emerging that development teams are looking at, you know, possible replacements for what they have, or new versions of what they already have. So I would suggest that a lot of the tools already exist in your environment, either from your developers, or if you buy software from another developer, you know, organization like Microsoft, for example. You know, those tools already exist. How they're being used now is different. So the idea is to be able to leverage the development tools and bring operations into those tools, and bring development into the operational tools like your service management suites. So the goal is to be able to integrate as much of those tools as possible, and where necessary, identify that there's a gap there, that we need something, you know, better, different, upgraded from what we have because of what we're trying to achieve. And I mentioned, you know, some of the tools that I've seen demoed, and I'll be honest with you, I mean, I haven't spent an enormous amount of time in the development tools because I'm not a developer. So I can look at them and see them from an operational perspective, but, you know, from like a source code repository tool or a development configuration management tool, you know, for me is a little bit like reading Martian. But I understand the concepts behind those tools, and more importantly, what I've started to see is those tools evolving into what I've coined the term social metrics, where the monitoring tools, they're all feeding data. They're flowing data from the development tools into the monitoring tools, into the service management tools. It's kind of cool. Kind of like the early days of service management, where we went from help desk tools to service management suites.
Thank you, Jane. And it's and again, we're getting more comments here. Didn't really know very much about DevOps. Thank you so much for the introduction to that. Lots to learn, lots to read. Thank you for the reading suggestions. And Rita started to say, do you see tools evolving for Agile and ITSM? And then said, oh, you just answered that for me, so thank you for that.
Well, can I just give you one example of that? And I'm very tool agnostic. So as I said, even on the ITSM tools, I don't always get to see the latest iterations of every tool. But I was at an ITSM tool conference last year, and I was really pleased to see that they had an Agile module. So if you wanted to manage your Agile sprints, what you were going to do in this sprint and how you're going to manage a product backlog, or things like that. It was actually baked into a service management tool, and I loved it. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that.
Oh, great. And those are all the questions that I have, Jane. So I just wanted to say to our audience, for those of you, if you have any other questions that you'd like Jane to answer, if you could submit those now, that would be great. And I wanted to mention that we will continue to bring you practitioner presentations discussing ITIL implementation experiences and challenges. And we know that you want to hear and learn from the practitioner experience. So if you'd like to share your story on our webinar, just let us know, because we'd be happy to partner with you and help you do that, as we've done in the past. And for those of you, just another reminder that our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, February 27th. And again, everyone's talking about Agile and Scrum, but how does Agile apply to service management and DevOps? So come and spend some time with us and with our certified Scrum Masters as they share their insights on how Agile can improve IT's velocity and time to value. And I think that's all our questions, Jane.
Well, thank you all for spending some time with me today, and I hope to see you, in the DevOps world some more.